When they lowered my husband's coffin into the ground, I thought that was the end of everything. The end of the arguments we never resolved. The end of the laughter that once filled our kitchen. The end of the man I had loved for more than 30 years. But as the final handful of soil fell on the wooden box, my phone buzzed in my purse. At first, I ignored it. Everyone was watching, everyone crying. I didn't want to seem rude or distracted at my husband's funeral. Yet something about that vibration felt strange, like it was calling me, pulling me away from the moment. When I finally took it out, there was a single message on the screen. No name. No contact picture. Just one short line. He's not dead. Trust no one. For a moment, my mind went completely blank. I looked around the cemetery, the crying faces, the priest reading his final words. Everything felt distant, like I was underwater. I wanted to believe it was a cruel prank, maybe a wrong number, maybe just my tired brain playing tricks after days of grief. But the message came again, exactly 10 minutes later. Same words. Same number. Same cold chill running through my chest. That was the moment my world stopped being familiar. And everything I thought I knew about my husband and about love, and about trust began to fall apart. My husband, Daniel, had passed away suddenly. A heart attack, they said. He was a healthy man, always early to rise, always working on something in the garage or tending the small garden behind our house. We'd been married 32 years. We weren't perfect. No marriages. There were quiet dinners, long silences, and unspoken regrets, but there was also kindness, respect, and the sort of companionship that only grows through time. Daniel wasn't the kind of man to talk much about feelings. He believed in actions. If something broke, he fixed it. If I was sad, he made tea instead of speeches. And I loved that about him, or maybe I got used to it. When he passed, it felt unreal. One moment, he was trimming the hedge. The next, he was on the ground, eyes open but empty. The doctor said it was instant. That he didn't suffer. But my heart did. In the days that followed, the house became too quiet. People came and went, neighbors, church friends, relatives I hadn't seen in years. They brought food, flowers, condolences. But grief has a strange way of isolating you, even in a crowd. The night before the funeral, I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at Daniel's old phone on his bedside table. The screen was cracked, dusty. He hadn't used it for months since switching to a newer model. Something about it felt heavy, like it still held his silence inside. I picked it up and turned it on. The battery was dead. I plugged it in. For a moment, the black screen flickered and then came to life. There were only a few messages. Mostly reminders, work notes, texts from me. But one caught my eye. It was from a contact saved only as E. The last message was sent 3 days before he died. It read, "Same place, same time. Don't bring her." My stomach twisted. I didn't know anyone named E. And her. Was that me? I tried to push the thought away. Maybe it was a work friend. Maybe her meant someone else. But as I stood beside his coffin that morning, the message wouldn't leave my mind. When the unknown text came, "He's not dead. Trust no one." It felt like that message from E had somehow come alive. After the burial, people came to hug me, whispering kind words. I barely heard them. I just wanted to be alone. That evening, after everyone left, I sat in the living room with Daniel's phone beside mine. I dialed the number that had sent the strange message. No answer. Then, after a few seconds, a voicemail began to play. It was Daniel's voice. "Leave a message after the tone," it said, in that calm, steady voice I knew too well. My breath caught. His number should have been disconnected. I had returned his SIM card when I handled the papers. So how was his voice still there? I hung up, my hands trembling. The next few days felt like walking through fog. I'd find his shirts still hanging in the closet, his handwriting on the shopping list, his favorite mug on the counter. Grief plays tricks on you. It makes you see meaning in ordinary things. But something deeper felt wrong. I started noticing details that didn't fit. A drawer I'd never opened before locked. A small key I didn't recognize, taped under his desk. An envelope inside the drawer, addressed to no one. Inside were photographs. Old ones. But not from our life. They showed Daniel standing beside a woman I didn't know. She had light brown hair, kind eyes, and she looked happy. Too happy. In some pictures, there was a little boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old. Daniel's arm was around him. On the back of one photo, written in Daniel's handwriting, were the words, "Ellen and Michael 2012. My heart pounded. Ellen. The E from the message. I sat there for a long time, staring at those pictures. I wanted to believe there was some innocent explanation. Maybe she was a cousin, or a friend from years ago. But deep down, I already knew Daniel had lived another life. And somehow, that life was not finished yet. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, the photos spread out before me like fragments of a stranger's life. Daniel's handwriting, his smile in those pictures, the way he looked at that woman Ellen, it was all too real. I tried to convince myself that I was mistaken. That maybe it was before we met. But the date on the back of the photograph, 2012, told another story. We'd been married 20 years by then. For a long time, I just stared at his side of the bed. The pillow still had his shape. The air still carried his faint scent, that mix of soap and old wood from the garage. I whispered into the quiet, "Who were you, Daniel?" And of course, no answer came. When morning light filled the room, the world looked the same, but I wasn't. Grief had turned into something else: confusion, fear, even guilt. Was I a fool all these years? Had everyone known but me? I made tea, but couldn't drink it. The spoon clinked softly in the cup, the only sound in the kitchen. Then, my phone buzzed again. A message. Same unknown number. "You weren't supposed to find the pictures yet." My breath caught. My hands trembled so hard that the cup fell and shattered. I typed back quickly. "Who are you? What do you want?" No reply. That afternoon, Daniel's old friend Martin came to see me. He'd been his colleague at the town's maintenance department for years. A kind man, always soft-spoken. He sat on the couch, holding his hat nervously. "I wanted to see how you're holding up," he said. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Trying to, Martin. It's strange, you know." He looked at me with gentle eyes. "You two were together a long time. It'll take time." I hesitated. Then asked, "Martin, do you know anyone named Ellen?" For a split second, he froze. Then he looked down at his hands. "Why do you ask?" I watched his face closely. I found some old photos. Daniel and a woman named Ellen. A boy too. He sighed deeply. "He never told you, did he?" My chest tightened. "Told me what?" Martin hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Before you two met, Daniel used to live up north, in a small town called Harrowfield. He worked there for a few years." I frowned. He told me he lived in Chicago before we married. He did, Martin said softly. But before that, he was in Harrowfield. With Ellen. They had a family. I couldn't breathe. My voice came out small. He was married before? Martin shook his head. Not married. But they had a son. Michael. The room spun. I felt like the floor had been pulled from under me. Why didn't he ever tell me? I whispered. I don't know, Martin said quietly. He said things ended badly. That she moved away. He never spoke of them again. I pressed my hand to my mouth. Tears burned behind my eyes. For 30 years, I'd shared a bed, a home, a life with a man who had hidden an entire family. That night, I went through Daniel's desk again. I found an old USB drive taped under the drawer. I plugged it into my laptop. There was only one file, a voice recording. When I played it, Daniel's voice filled the room. It was shaky, like he'd recorded it in a hurry. If you're hearing this, it means I couldn't fix what I started. I wanted to protect you, not lie to you. There are people who think I'm dead now. And maybe it's better that way. But please, don't trust anyone who asks about Ellen or Michael. They're not safe. And neither are you if you keep digging. Then the recording ended abruptly. I sat frozen, heart pounding. Protect me from what? I whispered. For the first time, I felt real fear. The next day, I packed a small bag. If there was another life Daniel had hidden, I needed to see it. I needed answers, even if it meant breaking the image I had carried for decades. The drive to Harrowfield took 4 hours. It was a quiet town surrounded by endless fields, old houses, and narrow streets. When I arrived, I stopped by a small diner. The waitress, an older woman with gray curls, brought me coffee. "Excuse me," I asked gently. "Do you happen to know a woman named Ellen?" "Ellen Morris." She frowned, thinking. "Ellen Morris. Oh, yes, she used to live here. Moved away a few years back after her husband passed." I felt my heart skip. Her husband. The woman nodded. "Yeah. Man named Daniel. Nice fella. Died in some accident, I think." I froze, staring at her. "My husband," I said softly, "was Daniel too. But he died just last week." She blinked, confused. Then, "I don't understand." Neither did I. The waitress gave me an address, Ellen's old place by the river. When I got there, the house was quiet, half covered by vines. The windows were dusty, the front gate broken. I stepped inside. The air smelled of damp wood and dust. Old photos still hung on the walls, Daniel and Ellen, Daniel and the boy. I found a box in the living room with papers inside, birth certificates, letters, old bills. The name on one letter made my hands shake. Michael Daniels. Born 2006. Father, Daniel Ross. Mother, Ellen Morris. My Daniel. On the corner of the letter, someone had written in red ink, "Find her before they do." Just then, a floorboard creaked behind me. I turned sharply. A young man stood in the doorway, eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm Daniel's wife," I said softly. "And you must be Michael." He stared at me for a long time, confused, cautious, angry. Then he whispered, "You shouldn't have come here. They'll follow you." I didn't know what to say. He looked so much like Daniel, same eyes, same quiet sadness. "Who will follow me?" I asked. But before he could answer, a car door slammed outside. Michael's face turned pale. "They found you," he said. We have to go. Now. I stood frozen, clutching my bag, my heart racing. Who's after me? He didn't reply, he just grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the back door. We ran out into the tall grass behind the house, down toward the riverbank. I could hear footsteps, men's voices shouting from behind the house. When we reached the trees, Michael stopped and turned to me. They think you know what he was hiding, he said breathlessly. You have to trust me, Dad wasn't who you thought he was. What was he? I whispered. Michael looked down at the ground. He worked for them. The same people who made him disappear. The wind along the river was cold that evening, carrying a faint scent of rain and soil. My shoes sank into the mud as I tried to catch my breath. Everything that had once been still inside me now trembled like a leaf. I looked at the young man beside me, Daniel's son, though he didn't say the word. He looked at me like someone unsure if I was real. We hid behind the trees until the voices faded. Michael didn't speak for a while. He just stared across the water, his hands shaking. Then, in a low voice, he said, "They were never supposed to find you." "Who are they?" I asked quietly. "The people Dad worked for. The ones who helped him disappear." I frowned, confused. Disappear? You mean, when? He looked at me, his eyes full of pain. 13 years ago. When he left us. We thought he was dead too. His words hit me like a wave. He told me he'd lost contact with his family years ago. He said there was nothing left to go back to. Michael shook his head. He was forced to leave. There was a fire at the lab he worked for. They said it was an accident, but it wasn't. Dad found something he wasn't supposed to find. What kind of lab? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Research, he said. Private contracts, government stuff. He never talked about it, but I used to see the files. Then one night, men came to the house. He told Mom to take me and run. He stayed behind. My chest tightened. And you never saw him again? Not until I saw his picture online, he said softly. An obituary. I thought it was finally over, but then I got the message, the same one you did. From his old secure number. It said he wasn't dead. The world around me blurred. I sat on a fallen branch, the weight of his words sinking in. He tried to protect both of us, I whispered. 2 lives, 2 families. He thought if we didn't know about each other, we'd be safe. Michael nodded. That's what I think too. But now someone knows you're looking. We waited until dark before leaving the woods. Michael drove an old pickup he had hidden under a tarp. The road was narrow and empty, the headlights slicing through mist. I sat in silence, staring at the rain-streaked glass, thinking about the man I thought I knew. The man who fixed clocks, planted roses, and left his coffee cup half full every morning. The same man who had apparently lived in hiding, carrying a secret heavy enough to bury him twice. We stopped at a small motel on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered vacancy. Inside, the room smelled of damp carpet and soap. Michael locked the door, closed the curtains, and sat on the bed. He looked younger now, almost lost. Dad left a letter, he said finally. I didn't understand it back then. Maybe you can. He took out an envelope from his jacket. It was creased, the paper yellowing at the edges. The handwriting was Daniel's, I would have known it anywhere. Inside were 2 pages. The first line made my throat tighten. If you're reading this, it means the past has caught up again. There are things I did that I can't undo. I lied not to hurt you, but to protect what was left of us. The people I worked for weren't who they said they were. When I refused to keep quiet, they erased me. I read those words over and over. Every sentence felt like a confession and an apology. He had faked his own death once to escape the people hunting him. He'd changed his name, started over, found me, built a new life. And all this time, he'd been living with the fear that one day the truth would return. On the second page, he wrote something that made my hands tremble. If they ever find me again, they'll come for you. Ellen knows where the file is. Tell her it's safe to let it go. And tell Michael. I never stopped watching over him. I looked up at Michael, tears in my eyes. Do you know what file he's talking about? He nodded slowly. Mom found something years ago. A flash drive, hidden inside a clock he'd built. She said it was dangerous. That's when she disappeared too. Disappeared. I repeated. He looked away. 3 years ago. No one's seen her since. The silence that followed was heavy. The rain tapped softly against the window, like distant footsteps. I thought of Ellen, the woman from the photographs, the one I'd hated for a day, then pitied the next. Maybe she hadn't been a rival at all. Maybe she'd been just another person trying to survive Daniel's unfinished story. I lay awake most of that night, listening to the rain. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's face. Not the one from our wedding photos, or from the hospital, but a tired version, a man carrying too much truth. I realized how little I had truly known him. How love sometimes grows in the shadow of secrets we can't see. By morning, Michael was gone. On the nightstand was a note in his handwriting. I'm going to find the file. Don't try to follow. They're watching. I felt a rush of panic. I opened the door, but his truck was already gone. The parking lot was empty except for a stray dog wandering near the fence. I sat down, my hands shaking. For the first time since Daniel's death, I cried, not out of grief, but exhaustion. The kind that seeps into your bones. That afternoon, I checked my phone. Another message from the same unknown number. He's with them now. You have to finish what he started. I drove back home that evening, the sky bruised with clouds. The house felt smaller now, colder. Every room echoed with a memory. On the kitchen counter, I placed Daniel's old phone, the one with the cracked screen. When I turned it on again, a new voice message appeared, one that hadn't been there before. It was Daniel's voice, softer this time, recorded not in fear but in peace. If this reaches you, it means I'm gone for good. Don't chase ghosts, my love. What I did to keep you alive. The world is full of truths that destroy the people who find them. Let it rest. Live for both of us now. The message ended with silence, not abrupt, but gentle, like a door closing quietly in another room. I stood there for a long time, the phone warm in my hand, tears running down my face. I wanted to hate him for lying. I wanted to scream at him for leaving twice. But all I felt was the kind of sorrow that carries love inside it. That night, I sat by the window watching the rain fall, each drop catching the porch light like tiny stars. I realized that maybe the secret he'd kept wasn't just about danger or betrayal. Maybe it was about love, the strange, flawed kind that makes people do impossible things. Maybe Daniel believed that the only way to protect the people he loved was to disappear from all of them. And maybe he was right. When I finally went to bed, I whispered into the dark, I forgive you. No voice answered, but somehow, the silence felt less empty. The letter lay on the kitchen table for 2 whole days before I dared to open it. I would sit there every morning with my tea, staring at the envelope as if it might vanish. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Daniel's steady, careful writing, the same one he used when he labeled the jars in our pantry or wrote birthday cards for the grandchildren. I ran my fingers over the ink again and again, my throat tightening each time. How could there be a letter? He was gone. On the third morning, when the rain started to fall softly outside, I finally broke the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet, yellowed a little around the edges. His words began simply, the way he always spoke to me. "My dear Mary," it said, "if you're reading this, it means I couldn't tell you everything before I left." I remember the way my hands trembled. I had expected a goodbye note, maybe a message of love or gratitude. But those words "I couldn't tell you everything" hit me like a gust of cold wind. He went on. "There are things you never knew about me. Not because I didn't trust you, but because I wanted to keep you safe. When we moved to Maplewood in 1987, it wasn't just for a fresh start. I'd been working with a small team that investigated corporate fraud people who were powerful and dangerous. After the case fell apart, I was advised to disappear quietly. That's why I changed my name from David H. Collins to Daniel Hart. I thought I could put it behind me, but part of that old life found me again last year." I paused, letting those words sink in. My husband, my Daniel, who had spent decades fixing garden fences, helping neighbors, and baking apple pies, had once been someone else entirely. I continued reading. "They threatened to reopen the past, Mary. I didn't want you or the children to be dragged into it. So, I handled it the only way I knew how, quietly. If you find a box in the attic labeled, 'Tools,' open it. Inside, you'll find documents that explain everything. I'm sorry for the silence. I did it for love, not out of fear." By the time I reached the end, tears blurred the page. I sat there in the stillness of our kitchen, the rain whispering on the windows, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not even disbelief. Just a deep, aching sadness that he had carried such a heavy burden alone. That evening, when the light began to fade, I went up to the attic. The air was thick with dust, and the old wooden boards creaked under my steps. Boxes were stacked neatly, labeled with Daniel's tidy handwriting. Christmas, old clothes, books. And then, in the far corner, I saw a small box that simply said, "Tools." My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, were a few items. An old ID card with a photo of Daniel looking younger, a different name printed underneath, some official letters, and a worn notebook filled with his writing. There was also a smaller envelope with my name again. Inside that one was a single page. "If anything ever happens, tell them the truth, Mary. I was never a criminal. I was trying to expose one." I remember sitting down right there on the attic floor, clutching the paper to my chest. I felt both proud and heartbroken. Proud because my husband had stood up for what was right. Heartbroken because he had faced it all in silence, never sharing that weight with me. Later that night, when I looked through the notebook, I found names and dates, small clues about a case he'd been involved in, something about a company laundering money through charities. It was all written in his careful, precise style. There were also pages filled with reflections, thoughts about our life, about me, about our children. One line made me stop and read it again and again. "If I can keep Mary safe, I can live with anything." That was when I started to understand. The distance I had felt in him during his last few years wasn't coldness. It was fear, not of death, but of what might come for us if the truth surfaced. In the days that followed, I contacted an old family friend, Paul, who had worked with Daniel years ago at the local paper. He came over one afternoon, his face lined with surprise and disbelief as I laid out the documents on the table. "Mary," he said softly, "I think he was telling the truth. I remember when he left the city suddenly. There were rumors he'd uncovered something big, something that scared people. He never talked about it again. Paul took some of the papers to a lawyer he knew. Within a week, they confirmed that Daniel's old employer had indeed been tied to a major investigation decades ago. Most of it had been buried quietly, but pieces of it matched what was in his notebook. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or even more heartbroken. My husband had lived his entire life under a shadow, protecting a truth he could never share. One evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, staring at the fading sky. I whispered into the cool air, "Why didn't you tell me, Daniel?" Of course, there was no answer. Only the sound of the wind moving gently through the trees. But deep inside, I could almost hear his calm, reassuring voice. "Because I didn't want you to live in fear." A strange peace began to settle over me then. For years, I had wondered why he sometimes sat awake at night, staring into the dark, lost in thought. Now I knew. And somehow, knowing the truth made me love him even more. A week later, I received another surprise. The lawyer called to say that one of Daniel's old contacts had come forward. He had found a sealed letter in his office drawer, written by Daniel years ago, marked, "To be delivered upon my death." Inside that letter was a confession of sorts, not a confession of guilt, but a record of what he had done, with evidence clearing his name and exposing the company's crimes. The man wanted to release it publicly. I gave my consent. When the article appeared online a few weeks later, it painted a portrait of a man who had sacrificed his peace for justice. The comments flooded in messages from people who remembered Daniel as a kind neighbor, a quiet man with a warm smile. None of them knew the weight he carried, but now they did. And in some way, it felt like he was finally free. I printed the article and placed it in a frame above the fireplace. Every time I pass by it, I touch the corner of the glass and whisper, "You did it, Daniel. You can rest now." Still, there were nights when the house felt too quiet. I would wake up, half expecting to see him in his chair by the window, reading or writing something in his notebook. Sometimes, I could almost smell his cologne, faint and familiar. Grief is a strange thing. It doesn't vanish. It just softens. It becomes part of you, like an echo that fades but never truly disappears. There were moments when I felt anger trying to rise, anger that he hadn't trusted me with the truth. But each time, I remembered his reason: love. And love has a way of silencing anger, like a calm tide washing over restless waves. One afternoon, I visited his grave again. The autumn leaves had started to fall, and the air carried that quiet chill that comes before winter. I brought fresh flowers, just as I always did. "I found your truth," I whispered, kneeling down. "You didn't fail me, Daniel. You never did." A single leaf drifted down and landed on the stone, and I took it as a sign, maybe silly, maybe wishful, but it felt like his way of answering. After that day, something in me changed. I stopped feeling like a widow waiting for closure. Instead, I felt like a guardian of his story. I decided to write everything down: the letters, the discovery, the memories, not to share it publicly, but to preserve it for our children and grandchildren. They deserve to know who he truly was. Not just the gentle father and husband, but the brave man who stood for truth even when it cost him his peace. As I wrote, I found myself healing. Each word felt like a thread stitching something back together inside me. Sometimes I would pause, close my eyes, and hear his laugh, that deep, warm laugh that filled our home for so many years. I knew he was gone, but in a strange way, I also knew he was still with me. In the quiet moments. In the scent of coffee in the morning. In the way sunlight fell on his favorite chair. Love, I've learned, doesn't end when a person leaves. It simply changes shape. It becomes memory, then strength, then peace. I started waking up differently after that. Mornings no longer felt heavy with the weight of secrets or grief. The sunlight streaming through the curtains seemed softer, warmer, almost like it was gently reassuring me that life, no matter how complicated, keeps moving forward. I still missed Daniel, of course, every day, every small moment, every quiet laugh that had once echoed in our home. But I also felt a new understanding of him, of love, and of the sacrifices people make quietly, without asking for recognition or thanks. I spent more time with my children, not just in routine conversation, but in moments of presence, baking cookies, walking through the park, sitting on the porch in the evenings watching the sky fade into twilight. I told them little pieces of the story I had discovered, careful to leave out the dangerous details but keeping the essence, that their father had once lived a life none of us knew about, not out of selfishness, but to protect the ones he loved. My children listened, eyes wide, faces reflecting both astonishment and a new admiration for him. One afternoon, I found myself going through the old photographs Daniel had kept. The photos of him and Ellen, and young Michael, were still tucked in a small wooden box in the attic. I held them in my hands for hours, looking at the smiles that belonged to a life I had never shared with him, and yet somehow felt connected to now. I realized something then, that Daniel's love was bigger than any one life, any one family. He had carried love for multiple worlds, and he had done it silently. It wasn't easy at first. There were nights when I would sit in his chair, staring at the floor, and tears would spill freely. I'd whisper his name, and the house would answer with its own quiet echoes. Sometimes I could almost feel him sitting beside me, the ghost of a hand brushing my shoulder, the faint sound of his deep voice calling me, Mary. These moments were both comforting and painful, but they reminded me that love doesn't disappear with a person. It transforms, like the sun turning into evening light, always present, even if unseen. Then came the day I decided to reach out to Michael. I had his number tucked safely in my notebook, and I sent a message that simply said, "Can we meet?" I didn't know what I would say, or if he would even want to see me. But I needed closure, and perhaps a bridge between the lives Daniel had created. Michael responded quickly. He said, "Yes. Meet me at the old diner in Harrow Field. Noon." When I arrived, he was already there, sitting in the same booth I had once approached as a stranger. He looked taller now, more like the man his father had raised him to be, though the same vulnerable boy's eyes remained. I sat down, and for a long moment, we didn't speak. We just looked at each other, letting the years of silence fill the space between us. Finally, he said, "I've thought about you a lot, Mary. About Dad. About how he loved both of us in ways neither of us could have imagined." I nodded, swallowing hard. "I've thought about him too. And about the choices he made. I understand now. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive him for keeping secrets, but I see why he did it. And I love him anyway." He smiled faintly, a shadow of the boy who had run from the house all those years ago. "I think that's what he would have wanted you to do. To keep living. Not to hate him, but to carry the truth forward and be strong." We talked for hours. About Daniel. About the family he had hidden. About the fear and the courage it must have taken to live that life without us knowing. And for the first time, I felt a sense of connection, a link between the woman I had been, the woman I was becoming, and the child who had shared his father's secret. When I returned home, I placed the photographs back in the box. I didn't hide them, but I didn't display them either. They were part of Daniel's story, and now part of mine too. A story of courage, love, and the heavy weight of responsibility. I realized that life is rarely simple. It is messy, complicated, and sometimes unfair. But it is also beautiful, if we allow ourselves to see the love hidden in the shadows. The following weeks were a quiet adjustment. I began writing everything down, not just the facts, but the feelings. The moments of grief, the moments of anger, the moments of understanding. I wrote for Daniel, yes, but also for myself. Writing became a balm, a way to honor his life and the choices he had made. Sometimes I would read aloud the letters he had left, hearing his voice as though he were there beside me. And in those moments, the house felt warm again, alive with memory and love. I also started reconnecting with the community in ways I had never done before. I shared stories of Daniel's courage with close friends, with people who had known him, and slowly, a network of understanding grew around me. People who had seen him as a quiet man began to see him as a hero in their own right, someone who had made sacrifices that most of us would never comprehend. And yet, the most profound change was inside me. I began to walk taller, speak softer, and live with a deeper awareness of the fragility of life. I understood that love sometimes demands silence, that protection can take strange and difficult forms. And I understood that forgiveness is not about excusing what someone did, but about releasing the pain it caused, so that love can endure. I visited his grave often, but not in sorrow. Instead, I brought flowers, sometimes a small photograph of Daniel's boy, Michael, and whispered stories into the wind. I talked about my day, the children, the little things that had filled our life. And each time, I felt a quiet connection, a reassurance that love transcends even death. One afternoon, as I was watering the roses in the backyard, the same roses Daniel had planted, I realized that I had stopped waiting for closure. I had found it in my own way. In the truth, in understanding, in forgiveness, and in the quiet resilience that comes from facing a hidden past and choosing to carry on. Life went on, gentle and steady. The seasons changed, leaves fell, snow came, and melted again. I continued to share memories of Daniel with my family, not just as the husband and father I had known, but as the man who had lived a life full of courage, secrets, and love. I began to see that the story he had left behind wasn't just about danger or deceit. It was about the power of love to protect, even when it must hide. It was about the strength required to face unimaginable risks and still think of the people you cherish most. And it was about the quiet heroism that often goes unnoticed in the ordinary lives we live. Some nights, when the house was still, I would sit by the window with my notebook, writing, listening to the wind in the trees. I could almost hear Daniel's calm, steady voice, reminding me that life, even after secrets, continues. That love persists. That memories carry a kind of immortality. I learned to laugh again, softly, in small bursts at first, then more fully. I began to find joy in the simplest things: a child's smile, the smell of fresh bread, the sunlight on the leaves. And each time I did, I felt a sense of peace. Not because Daniel was gone, but because I understood him, and because I had chosen to carry his story with me, honoring it in my own quiet, heartfelt way. I also reached out to Ellen, cautiously at first, through Michael. We spoke for the first time in years. She told me about their life, about Michael, about how she had feared for them all. And though it was strange and emotional, I realized that there was no room for anger. Only understanding. Only gratitude that Daniel had tried, in his own complicated way, to protect all of us. As I hung up the phone that day, a calm warmth spread through me. I felt connected to the wider circle of love Daniel had created, even if I had only glimpsed it at the edges. It was bigger than my pain. Bigger than grief. Bigger than secrets. Months later, I sat with my grandchildren in the garden, telling them stories about their grandfather. I spoke of his laughter, his kindness, his love of simple things, and the courage he had shown. And I told them gently, about the choices he had made, and why. They listened, rapt, wide-eyed, and I felt Daniel's presence in the way they smiled at each other, in the way they laughed at his quirks, in the way love flowed silently through generations. At night, I would sometimes whisper into the dark, "Thank you, Daniel, for everything." And though he was gone, I felt him in the quiet, in the gentle rhythm of life, in the love that had survived secrets, dangers, and time. I understood finally that the truth of a person is often deeper than the life we see on the surface. That love is not always loud or obvious. That sometimes the greatest acts of courage are hidden, and the greatest sacrifices are silent. And I learned to live, carrying both the sorrow and the joy, the secrets and the understanding, the loss and the love, in my heart. Because that is what Daniel had wanted. And that is what I would carry forward, a life lived fully, with forgiveness, with gratitude, and with love that reaches beyond death, beyond secrets, beyond the past. And in the end, I understood that life, even when shadowed by hidden truths, can still be beautiful, still be rich with love, still offer peace to those who are willing to see it. The days grew longer, and the sun lingered a little more in the sky. I spent mornings walking through the garden, tending the roses Daniel had planted, watching them bloom as if each petal carried a memory of him. Sometimes I paused, letting the breeze brush my face, and imagined him there beside me, gentle, calm, smiling in his quiet way. I found myself smiling more often, too. Not the forced kind of smile that hides pain, but a soft one that grows from understanding and acceptance. Life had given me a gift, in its own complicated way, the chance to see Daniel fully, even after he was gone. To know his courage, his love, and his sacrifices. And through that knowledge, to carry him forward in the way I lived each day. The children visited often, and I would tell them stories, not just the ones from our life together, but the stories I had discovered about his hidden past. They listened, rapt and thoughtful, learning that love can take many forms, and sometimes it asks for quiet strength. And in their eyes, I saw hope, understanding, and the kind of connection that carries forward even after someone has left. I also kept in touch with Michael and Ellen. Our conversations were careful at first, fragile like glass, but over time, they became warm, full of laughter and shared memories. We weren't replacing the years we had lost, but we were building something new, a bond formed not by blood alone, but by shared understanding and love. Sometimes, when I sat by Daniel's grave, I spoke aloud. Not to mourn, but to reflect. "I forgive you," I whispered. "I understand why you kept your secrets. I see the love behind your silence." And in the quiet, I imagined his voice replying softly, reassuring me, reminding me to live fully, to love fully, and to carry hope with me. Life continued its gentle rhythm. Seasons changed. Leaves fell and new ones grew. The world kept moving, as it always does. And I moved with it, slowly, carefully, carrying Daniel's story, his courage, his hidden sacrifices, and his love with me every step of the way. I realized that our lives are made up of small moments, quiet choices, and unseen acts of love. Sometimes, the people we cherish most carry burdens we cannot imagine. And sometimes, understanding, forgiveness, and patience are the greatest gifts we can offer, not just to them, but to ourselves. And so I live on, carrying the warmth of Daniel's memory, the lessons of his life, and the quiet strength of love that endures beyond secrets, beyond absence, and beyond time itself. Every morning, when I see the sunlight touch the roses, I smile. I whisper his name. I remember. And I am grateful. Because in the end, love is what remains. Love, even after secrets. Love, even after loss. Love, always. And that is the story I carry, the story I live, the story I tell, not with sorrow, but with quiet, enduring hope.